18 months. What America's experiment in populist government is telling us, if we're willing to listen. I have skied for 45 years. For more than a decade, I built a working life in the French Alps around that passion. Ski seasons running into each other. Work as a chalet host, a chef, a driver, whatever paid the bills and kept me close to the mountains. It was hard graft much of the time. But it bought me a season pass and a bed near the slopes, and that gave me access to a mountain landscape I could ski almost daily. The off-piste, the deep snow, the high routes. The reason I was there at all, I could have done the kitchen work, the chalet work, the driving back in Britain. I didn't choose France for the jobs. I chose France for what the jobs unlocked. A life organized around something I cared about deeply, made possible by a European settlement that millions of British people quietly used to build similar lives for themselves over 40 years of integration. We voted to dismantle that settlement in 2016. The promise then was that we would take back control. That ordinary working people would benefit from the end of arrangements that had only ever really served the metropolitan elite. That the establishment had been getting away with it for too long, and the time had come to break their grip. I don't need to rehearse what actually happened. First lived it. Freedom of movement gone. My alpine working life dismantled, and the architects of the promise quietly relocated to whichever financial centre would still have them. The people who were forgotten are still forgotten. The architects of the promise have done considerably better than the people who voted for it. I tell you this not to relitigate Brexit. First tell you this because exactly the same political technology is now being field-tested in America, and the results are coming in faster and more clearly than most British commentary has noticed. And because what comes next in Britain almost certainly involves another version of that same offer, from people who have been studying the American playbook carefully. First have seen one version of this story already. Here is the pattern I think I recognize. 18 months. The Trump administration came to power in January 2025 on a pitch that was rhetorically identical to the one that delivered Brexit. Drain the swamp. For the forgotten working class. Against the establishment that had abandoned ordinary Americans to globalization, deindustrialization, and an indifferent political class. The diagnosis contained something real. The grievance was legitimate. The deindustrialized Midwest, the opioid devastation, the wage stagnation, the sense that politicians of both parties had stopped seeing them at all. These were not invented problems. They were the genuine cost of 40 years of economic restructuring that had benefited some Americans extravagantly and left others behind entirely. 18 months in. Where has the prescription landed? In May 2026, according to reporting tracked closely by Heather Cox Richardson and Peter Zeihan among others, the administration settled a lawsuit it had brought against the federal government, establishing what has been characterized as a $1.776 billion anti-weaponization fund to compensate political allies the administration claims were persecuted under the previous administration. The structure of the settlement, with the administration effectively controlling both sides of the negotiation, drew open judicial criticism from the overseeing judge. Zeihan's comparison was to settlement structures historically associated with Maduro's Venezuela and Nigerian governments of the 1990s. Forbes reporting separately calculated that the tax immunity arrangement extended to the president around the same period could save him over $600 million on his 25% income and licensing arrangements. Assistant reporting. Jared Kushner and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff have been conducting parallel foreign policy negotiations that intersect with their private business interests, including the family's World Liberty financial crypto venture, generating revenue streams substantially outside congressional oversight. The administration has reportedly sought $1 billion of federal funding for security at the president's ballroom project, with some reporting maybe used in part for restitution to convicted January 6 rioters. The Iran intervention has stalled, Saudi Arabia having denied American access to its bases and airspace. The tariff regime has become so chaotically administered that businesses are increasingly building relationships with regulators not for compliance but for survival. In what Zeihan describes as the Russian 1990s model, deliberately contradictory legal guidance creating permanent dependency on executive goodwill. The president's approval rating sits at 34%. The pattern visible in this evidence is hard to read as anything other than systematic. The voters who put this administration in power on a promise of breaking elite self-dealing are watching what looks increasingly like the largest organized transfer of public resources to politically connected private interests in modern American history. The swamp they were promised would be drained has been replaced with a larger one, containing different beneficiaries. The people who were forgotten are still forgotten. Different people are now doing the forgetting. This is the model, not the exception. The temptation is to read this as a Trump problem, a failure of personality, judgment, or competence specific to one peculiar political figure. That reading is comfortable, and I think it is wrong. What we are watching in America looks less like a unique pathology than the operating logic of authoritarian populism as a political form. Viktor Orbán did something structurally similar in Hungary. Silvio Berlusconi in Italy. The pattern is consistent enough across enough national contexts to be predictive rather than coincidental. The mechanism works like this. The pitch requires a genuine enemy: the establishment, the elite, the metropolitan liberals, the immigrants, and a champion who claims to represent the forgotten. The grievance the pitch identifies is usually real, which is what makes it electorally effective. The diagnosis is often partly correct, but once in power, the champion requires funding, protection, and operational capacity. And these tend to come from exactly the interests the pitch identified as the enemy: the wealthy donors, the business interests seeking regulatory capture, the media owners willing to provide political cover, the security apparatus whose loyalty must be bought. Within 18 to 36 months, the champion has been substantially captured by these interests, while maintaining the rhetorical posture of representing the forgotten. The original coalition is gradually betrayed in policy while continually remobilized in rhetoric. New enemies are identified to explain the failure to deliver on the original promise. This looks less like a bug in populist movements than their structural logic once they cross from opposition into government. The voters who hoped for change tend to get the same elite governance with different beneficiaries and worse accountability. There is also a closer historical parallel available, and it is American rather than European. Heather Cox Richardson, the American historian whose forensic daily tracking of the current administration has been more analytically precise than most mainstream commentary, repeatedly reaches for the same comparison. What we are watching is structurally similar to the late 19th century robber baron period. Between roughly 1870 and 1900, the American economy industrialized at extraordinary speed, generating concentrations of private wealth that exceeded the capacity of the existing political system to constrain. Senators were openly bought. Courts aligned with capital. The press was substantially owned by the same interests it was meant to scrutinize. The mechanism Richardson identifies in the current slush fund is structural rather than metaphorical. The 1872 Credit Mobilier scandal saw railroad insiders create a fictional construction company to siphon federal subsidies into private pockets, with congressmen bribed through shares in the entity. The 2026 version uses a fake lawsuit settlement to achieve a similar transfer. The legal instruments differ. The operating logic is recognizable. The robber baron period was eventually contained, not by collapse, but by sustained reform across a generation. The progressive era from roughly 1890 to 1920 produced antitrust legislation, the income tax, direct election of senators, food and drug regulation, banking reform, eventually labor rights. The reform was possible because the corruption became so visible and so egregious that cross-class political coalitions formed against it. This sits within what Strauss and Howe described as the cyclical pattern of American renewal, what they called the fourth turning. American democracy moves through periods of crisis and reconstruction roughly every 80 years. The Civil War, the Depression and Second World War, and now arguably the present. Each crisis dismantles institutional arrangements that have outlived their usefulness and rebuilds something. The outcomes have historically been positive on the other side, but the passage through has rarely been clean. That history is worth holding on to. American democracy has been through periods structurally similar to this one before, and emerged with stronger institutions on the other side. The current situation is not unprecedented, and it is not necessarily terminal. But the reform that contained the original robber barons required muckraking journalism that could reach middle-class progressive readers, a labor movement with organizational capacity, and two political parties that both contained genuine reform wings. The contemporary information environment makes that kind of unified diagnosis much harder to achieve at scale. The historical precedent for containment exists. The conditions for replicating it are less obvious. What civil disorder might look like. The American situation contains a variable that distinguishes it from the European versions and deserves serious attention. The original coalition is beginning to recognize the betrayal. Not all of them. Some will follow the leader through any contradiction, but enough that the political math is starting to shift. 25 Republican senators broke publicly with the White House over the slush fund. The president's approval rating has fallen sharply. The midterms are coming. The institutions, despite sustained attack, are largely holding. Courts have constrained executive action. Congress is starting to push back on the Iran war powers question. The independent judiciary continues to function, if under stress. The federal structure means many key administrative functions remain outside direct executive control. In classical democratic theory, this is the good news. Strong institutions are the safeguard against authoritarian capture. The system is working. But there is a counterintuitive danger that most commentary is missing. The strong institutional resistance that prevents the full authoritarian scenario simultaneously creates a radicalization accelerant for the armed populist base. If the administration simply succeeded in overwhelming the institutions, supporters would have their victory, and most would go home satisfied. They are not psychologically prepared for the alternative outcome. Institutions holding firm, the president losing political battles, the midterms delivering a decisive rejection. That outcome will likely not be experienced as democratic accountability working as intended. It will be experienced as the deep state, the establishment, the rigged system stealing what was rightfully theirs. The narrative has been carefully prepared for years. The permission structure is in place. The American context contains a variable that no European parallel does. The MAGA base is heavily armed, organized in places into paramilitary formations, and has the January 6 precedent demonstrating that political violence can carry negotiable consequences. The pardons confirmed it. What seems more plausible than classical civil war is what political violence researchers call distributed conflict. Sporadic, localized political violence without central coordination but with shared cultural permission. Targeted intimidation of election workers. Pressure on local officials. Sustained refusal to accept legitimate electoral outcomes by significant minorities of voters and the figures who claim to represent them. Anyone who has watched English football culture recognizes the basic dynamic. When the firm loses badly, they don't always go home quietly. The result is the trigger, not the cause. The humiliation needs an outlet. The American version of that dynamic operates in a context of much greater civilian armament than anything we have in Britain, and across geography that lacks the natural containment football violence has. The rearguard action, losing and refusing to accept it, is historically how democratic erosion can complete itself. Post-Reconstruction America provides one precedent. The Confederacy lost the war decisively. But the rearguard, terror campaigns, voter suppression, assassination of black political figures and federal officials effectively reversed Reconstruction's democratic gains over the following decade. The constitutional text remained intact. The democratic practice collapsed. That is one plausible model for what could follow if institutional resistance combines with electoral rejection and sustained refusal to accept outcomes. Not the only one, but one worth taking seriously. This is not a spectator sport. The British instinct when reading American political analysis is to maintain psychological distance. That is happening over there. Those are American problems. We have our own troubles, but at least we are not them. That instinct is going to cost us. American political instability is not a foreign news story for Britain. It is a direct economic, security, and normative threat. Economically, American disorder hits financial markets, supply chains, and the transatlantic trading relationship in ways that land immediately on British household budgets. The pound, energy prices, inflation, imported goods. Abstract political violence in Ohio becomes concrete at the petrol pump in Stoke and the supermarket in Sunderland. In security terms, the American institutional degradation we are watching is closer to a domestic security problem than a foreign policy one. NATO cohesion depends on American reliability. British defense and intelligence relationships with the US are deep enough that American chaos becomes our chaos faster than our institutions typically notice. But the most important blowback may be normative. What happens in America does not stay in America politically. Every erosion of democratic norms that goes unchecked becomes available as a template and precedent elsewhere. January 6th gave permission. The pardons gave permission. The impunity gave permission. Nigel Farage watches, his funders watch. The tactical lessons are being learned and adapted for British conditions in real time. Now look at Britain. Reform's pitch is structurally identical to 2016 Trump and 2016 Vote Leave. Outsiders against the establishment. Champions of the forgotten communities. The metropolitan liberal elite as enemy. Farage himself has spent 30 years carefully cultivating the outsider positioning that the role requires. The grievance is, again, partly real. The community's reform speaks to have genuine economic and cultural complaints that mainstream British politics has handled badly. The diagnosis contains something true. That is what makes it electorally effective. But we now have an 18-month preview of how this model operates in government. Not from speculation or partisan attack, but from observable reality in the most powerful democracy in the world. Given that evidence, the relevant question is not whether reform's pitch is appealing. It clearly is to many people, for reasons that are not stupid or contemptible. The relevant question is what a reform government actually produces by 2031. Who are the British Kushners? Which regulatory bodies get captured first? Which communities that voted reform in hope find themselves where the Michigan auto worker who wanted his industry back now sits? Which businesses discover that compliance has been replaced by relationship with the regulator? Which institutions designed to constrain executive power get reformed into compliance? These are not hypothetical questions. They are the observable trajectory of the model we are being offered, in a country running 18 months ahead of us. The constitutional vulnerability nobody is naming. Here is where the analysis becomes genuinely urgent rather than merely worrying. British political commentary tends to assume our institutions are roughly as robust as American ones. They are not. In some critical respects, they are more vulnerable. The United States has a codified constitution, a Supreme Court with the power to strike down legislation, a federal structure distributing power away from the center, and explicit constitutional rights that sit above ordinary statute. Trump has been consistently frustrated by these constraints. Courts have blocked executive orders. The federal structure has preserved spaces of independent democratic governance. The constitutional architecture has done real work, even under sustained attack. Britain has none of this. Parliamentary sovereignty is absolute. What Parliament passes is law, with no constitutional review available to strike it down. There is no codified Bill of Rights sitting above statute. No federal structure. No equivalent independent judiciary with the power to constrain primary legislation. The entire British constitutional settlement rests on convention, precedent, and the assumption of good faith by those holding power. It works beautifully when everyone plays by the understood rules. It is exposed when someone decides not to. We already had the warning. Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament unlawfully, and was only stopped by an emergency Supreme Court ruling combined with sustained political pressure that ultimately required his own party to remove him. The guardrails held. But they held through political will and reputational cost, not through hard constitutional architecture. A more disciplined version of Johnson, which Farage arguably is, would not make the mistakes that made Johnson vulnerable. A reform government with a working Commons majority could do legally in an afternoon what Trump has spent 2 years fighting courts to achieve. Remove judicial review of executive action. Repeal the Human Rights Act. Restructure the BBC Charter. Remove Electoral Commission independence. Reform the House of Lords into compliance, presented as democratic renewal. The language for all of this is already written. It has been used in Budapest and Warsaw. Hungarian democracy was dismantled legally within existing constitutional frameworks by a parliamentary system without strong constitutional review. Viktor Orbán did not need to break the rules. He just needed to rewrite them while holding office. Britain's institutional architecture is closer to Hungary's than to America's. That fact is almost entirely absent from current political commentary. What I am and am not saying. I am not telling you who to vote for. I am not telling you reform supporters are stupid or contemptible. The grievances the movement speaks to are real and have been handled badly by the political mainstream for a long time. Anger at the existing settlement is legitimate. First, I'm asking you to look honestly at what happened to the people who voted for this promise before us, and to ask whether the outcome they got is the one you are hoping for. The American voters who put Trump in office, on a promise of breaking elite self-dealing, are watching what looks increasingly like the largest organized transfer of public resources to politically connected interests in modern American history conduct its business in front of them. The people who are forgotten are still forgotten. The promises were not kept. The beneficiaries are not the people who voted for the change. If we choose this path, these are the consequences. Not maybe, not theoretically, demonstrably from the evidence we have in front of us. The window to look at that evidence and think clearly about what it means is open. It is not permanently open. The American experiment is running 18 months ahead of us, and the results are visible to anyone willing to see them. The question is whether enough of us are willing to see them before the vote rather than after it. The analytical work in this piece draws particularly on Heather Cox Richardson's daily tracking of the Trump administration, on Peter Zeihan's geopolitical commentary, and on Strauss and Howe's fourth turning framework. Full references are available in the written version on Substack. Stay in the room.